So this is going to be a person fest. You're going to see OFI people coming through in sequential. So I have 10 to 15 minutes, and then everybody else has their times for the different sessions. What I'm simply doing is presenting the overall methodology, and then we'll be presenting the findings that we launched June 22nd of this year. Every year we have a launch with the updated estimations, and in 2015 we had the biggest update we've ever had. And then Adriana will also present destitutions, and I believe before that there might be some changes in time. I think that changes goes with the overtime, perhaps. And we will ditch this because we want you to have enough time to absorb the rest. So I think all of you will know by now that the MPI is an internationally, or tries to be internationally comparable measure. It has always been reported for over 100 developing countries. It was launched in 2010 by the UNDP and in its 20th anniversary Human Development Report, and has been published by UNDP in every Human Development Report since then. They didn't have a human report in 2012. It's been estimated by OFI in each of the years, and our estimations are published by UNDP. Also in 2014, the UNDP office made some other estimations and published both of them together. By 2016, we will have one MPI again. Often people make a confusion, and they think that the AF methodology is the global MPI, but it's not. The methodology is very flexible. It's a software wizard, let's say, but you can put into it what you want. And so the global MPI is one implementation, and it's only one implementation of the M0 measure that James will present in the afternoon, which is one measure of the class of measures in the methodology. So it's important to know, because sometimes people say, oh, can I change the indicators? Of course. The global MPI was very data constrained, and some of the indicators need to be improved upon. And so you have to remember that it's simply one possible implementation. And tomorrow we'll see some national implementations, and they have different numbers of dimensions, different indicators, different cutoffs, different weights. Everything's different. Because what is similar in this course and what we're trying to teach is the underlying methodology and how you select those indicators, cutoffs, and weights. But we're not trying to suggest that one particular set of dimensions, indicators, cutoffs, and weights is right, because it depends on the purpose of your exercise. And so that same methodology is then used for these national measures, and we'll go over that tomorrow. Is that clear? Hopefully it'll prevent some of the confusions that we've had before. Before I go to the 2015, I wanted to mention that in 2010, Maria Santos was in OFI, another Argentine. Argentina has a wonderful relationship with OFI. Adriana, Gaston, Mariana Lugo, many Argentines have come through. But the data quality has changed a lot, because in 2010, when the MPI was launched, there were 10 indicators for only 60% of the countries. In 2010, we launched the MPI for 104 countries. Now we have 10 indicators for 84% of the countries. And much of the other details we could go into is better in terms of the harmonization and the comparability of indicators within those surveys. If we look at all the MPIs that have been published, it's 117 countries from 217 data sets. What we do is we take a 10-year moving window of data. And so in 2010, it was obviously 2000 until 2008, because we didn't want to start before the MDGs. And then we've updated it. So now it would be 2004 to 2014, but we don't have any countries with 2004 data, so it's 2005 to 2014. Next year will be 2005 to 2015. So the data mean that we drop countries where the data are more than 10 years old. And so we've dropped 16 countries this year. We've also released and published, and they are on our database, and Table 7 online has all of these estimations in all countries in all periods. We have MPI estimations for 1,362 subnational regions, not just the level of MPI, but all of the statistics that we'll show. And as you do, our methodologies have evolved. So we began simply by reporting MPI headcount ratio intensity, and now we also talk about destitution, about inequality among the poor, standard errors, changes over time. And we also do robustness tests, and these results are better now. The data are more robust, the comparisons are more robust now than in 2010. So what are the dimensions, indicators, and weights? I'm introducing the vocabulary with one health warning. James this afternoon will call dimensions what I'm calling indicators. In that paper, in the theory paper, we call the columns of the matrix dimensions. In most applied work, we call the columns of the matrix indicators. And dimensions are sort of fuzzy conceptual categories that don't enter into the data, but that are useful when you're presenting your measure to the public. So that's the only difference between what I'm going to present. One of the differences. I'll mention the other in terms of weights and what James will present. So there are three conceptual dimensions of poverty: health, education, and living standards, which are the same normatively justified as in the Human Development Index, because this was developed for the 20th anniversary of the HDI. And they're also the same indicators as in the Human Poverty Index, which was the index the UNDP used before they released the MPI, as Shuman mentioned yesterday. The dimensions are equally weighted. They're also equally weighted in the HDI. And after its release, there was a lot of discussion in the literature about the equal weights of the HDI, Human Development Index. And so we've drawn on that literature. There was then an expert study of weights by Chaudhry and Squire. There were different conversations that seemed to turn around and validate the equal weights. So we've drawn on that for this structure. And then the indicators within each dimension are equally weighted. And graphically, you can see that. So for a person who doesn't want to go into fractions, you can sort of see the equal weights visually. The indicators are defined, the unit of identification is the household, which means that all of the information you have on your individual roster of household members has to be aggregated to identify each household and all its members as deprived or non-deprived in each indicator. So we're going to do that to develop a deprivation profile of zeros or ones for each of the 10 indicators, just like I said the counting tradition did. So for nutrition, you are deprived in nutrition if any member of the household for whom we have nutritional data is malnourished by less than 18.5 body mass index for adults and low undernutrition for children, 2 standard deviations from the reference population. You're deprived if any child has died in the last 5 years. So this year we introduced a change only for the countries we computed this year. So the child mortality is in the last 5 years. You are deprived if any child in your household is not attending school up to the age at which it would complete class 8. And if you don't have a child, you're non-deprived in that indicator. That's that one, sorry. And here you're deprived if you have no member of your household has completed 5 years of schooling. So again, think of the data that you have, and we'll talk about aggregating it in. We'll talk about applicable populations of households that do and don't have school, children who are in the age in which they would attend school. And then these are household level indicators, so they're much simpler. You don't have to do anything but see if the household cooks with wood, dung or charcoal. It's deprived in cooking fuel because solid cooking fuels create respiratory infections, a leading cause of preventable death in the global burden of disease. You're deprived if you don't have improved sanitation by the MDG indicators, or if it is shared. If you don't have safe drinking water by MDG standards, or walk more than 30 minutes round trip to obtain it. If you don't have electricity, if your floor is dirt, sand, or natural, and if you don't own more than one of a small set of assets, television, telephone, radio, bicycle, motorcycle, or refrigerator. And if you own a car or a truck, you're non-deprived in assets. Pause, Shugota. No.
Is there any particular significance of 5 years of schooling?
We tried 5 years, we tried 6 years, UNDP now says 6 years. The justification is as follows.
Primary schooling is defined by 5 years of schooling.
Primary schooling, if you look in the UNESCO tables, in some countries is 3 years, in some countries is 8 years. So there's a range. What we justified that as is when there is, UNESCO creates their schooling aggregate, they use 5 years. So we followed 5 years following UNESCO. UNDP has proposed changing it to 6 years. It's arbitrary, doesn't change much. But they said, well, if you take the mean years of primary school across the countries, it's 6 years. So there are different ways of justifying it. Doesn't really matter. Sorry, Pinaki first and then yourself.
Yes, why the more indicators are there to capture the living standard dimension in comparison with health and education? But what is the basic motivation to consider more indicators for dimension and living standard?
So when we met with Human Development Report Office, we were trying to figure out what to do. They wanted a new poverty indicator, and they wanted it to cover a lot of countries. So actually, to be honest, we started by what was possible. So we looked at the World Bank's surveys, the household budget surveys, and saw what dimensions we could get. We could get education, fine, but it was pretty weak on health. You only had water and sanitation. Then we looked at the DHS and mix, and the only indicators for which we could obtain data for most countries, more than 100 countries, were these plus vaccination. So we looked at initially lots and lots and then identified the number of countries with each indicator. And basically, so it was not, as I said, this is not a perfect measure. This is very much seeing what was possible with the data that we had. Then we looked at the MDGs. They're justified. 8 of 10 of them are the MDGs. The other 2 are related, electricity and fluorine. And then we also looked in the sense of the relationships among indicators. And we could talk about cooking fuel and electricity and why we have both of them. But it seems that there wasn't a value in dropping 4 of them and just having 2. It seems that having all of them with a lighter weight would make a more rigorous indicator because they were capturing each. There was not redundancy among them across all countries. Sam?
I can refer, I'll ask my question.
Okay. Sam?
Yes, have you performed any confirmatory factor analysis to try to see if these domains represent the constructs behind them and the reliability of the indicators you're using?
Yeah, so early on, Jose Manuel Roche, and he was on the team, did tetracork correlations and did factor analysis, but these are ordinal, these are binary. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about redundancy, then Paola and I will talk about why actually there's a different appropriate measure to assess associations between them. Initially, we played with everything because we didn't quite understand, we were still learning, and so it's just easiest to play empirically sometimes. But stepping back to think about what's appropriate for the variables that we have, we've now come to a different approach that we'll go through. Something?
Yeah, I completely agree and I endorse the multidimensional approach. And while we get the basic argument of coming out of economic domain to a multidimensional is a novel idea and exercise, but in the meantime we are also lacking because if I take India in the domain and I see this living standard does not capture any of the truly economic domain. Why I will comment on each of the indicators.
Please be very quick because my time is up and my colleagues will kill me.
No, for certain like say electricity, in urban India 95% have electricity and for rural area it's a community variable. Like say villages, 72% villages in Bihar does not have electricity.
Can we hold on this a little bit? Is that okay? Thank you. Is it urgent for now? Yeah.
Yeah, regarding the years of schooling, is there a rationale for choosing 5 or 3 or 8? What would be the rationale for that?
So what I mentioned before is that primary school is between 3 and 8. And is there a definition?
No.
So this is what you're asking, 5 years of schooling.
Yeah.
So that's what I just mentioned to Shugata, was that there is a UNESCO standard for using 5. You could look at 6, you could look at the average number of years of schooling by the mean or the median of the population-weighted countries that you're looking at. That would be another justification. But what we have to recognize is that primary school has different numbers of years, and so we don't want to say primary school completion if in one country is at 8 years and the other country is at 3 years.
So they don't consider things like the employability. If someone has 5 years of schooling, they can get a job or be able to go into a training to give them a job. So that does not.
You're looking at 100 countries, so you're not going to have one answer to that question. And so there's problems of a global measure because you are losing relevance in many of the contexts. You gain comparability, but to have a really good relevant measure, you need to go to the national level. Okay, I'm going to push on. Can I ask, because we're over time, can I take 5 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Those are the indicators, bye. These are the MDGs they identify, bye. I've already talked about them being the unit of identification is the household. We have entered 2 terms. Identification means if the household is deprived, poor, identified as poor, then all its members are poor. But when we report the MPI, the denominator is not the percentage of households, it's the percentage of people. So we use the term unit of analysis to say it's the percentage of the population who are MPI poor. I mention this because some countries use the percentage of households. So we need to basically be very clear what term we're using for which number. So what we do is we build up a deprivation score with these weighted indicators, Bouba and Bhutan. She's deprived in the colored indicators. So it's 3 of those indicators that are weighted 1/6, because these are 1/3, so it's 3 over 1/6, plus 3 of these that are weighted at 1/18, a third divided by the 6 indicators. So she's deprived in 67% of the indicators. It's more than 33%, and so she's identified as poor. That should be greater than or equal to. Here's another example. Natalie, this is a case study that Bouba did. So who's 20, and these are her profiles, and her deprivation score is the weighted sum of these, which is again 67%, different indicators. So like this, we start from each profile, which is going to be the same for all members of the household, and identify people as poor. It can be useful. I know that many of us are quantitative types, don't go to the field, don't talk with people in communities, don't use pictures in our presentations. But it can be useful for communicating, to do some ground reality checks and really meet some people who are poor by your country's definitions and listen to their stories. It also helps you deepen your understanding. For example, in Kenya, we were looking at this and the woman called and said, look, everybody here is cooking with charcoal. So please think about charcoal as a deprivation fuel, and we now have included it. So it's very useful in a number of ways. So we can talk more, and I won't for time, but we can talk more about the deprivations they have. They do get their water from a river. They don't have a protected floor or any adequate sanitation. And then the MPI is 2 things. It's the percentage of people who are poor because they're deprived in a third or more of the indicators. And you multiply it by intensity, which is the average percentage of deprivations that poor people experience. So Bouba was 60%, Natalie was 67%. So 67% plus 67% divided by 2 is the average intensity, and it's obviously 67%. Note you divide by the number of poor. When you have your exercise in this afternoon, some of you will make the mistake of dividing by the population. You divide for intensity by the number of poor people, because you're looking among the people who are poor to say how poor on average are the poor people. So just like Martin said yesterday, there's a number of issues in terms of the data that affect the comparability of the MPI. But it's going up a lot better. It doesn't have PPPs. We do use the same surveys, but there are missing dimensions like work or violence or empowerment. As I mentioned, for 16% of the countries, they miss 1 or 2 indicators. We report the missing values of the countries. The surveys are not all of the same year. The household survey data does not include women who are 50 and above, men who are 60 and above in many of the surveys. It doesn't include people in mental health homes, the homeless, the military, the monks and nuns. And it doesn't include income or consumption in the surveys that we have. So there are a number of constraints about this exercise, and it's important also to think about the constraints of your exercise and be open about them. So we are trying to obviously improve the data. The last thing I'll say is that what is new in our methodology from the counting approaches I presented in Latin America and Europe is intensity. That has two features. It gives you something like a poverty gap measure, the average intensity of poor people. If it's higher and lower, but the same head count ratio, then you have important information. It also, as James will show, gives some nice properties to the measure, which the head count ratio doesn't have. So just to see what it looks like, South Sudan and Niger South Sudan is less poor than Niger, but the intensity of Niger is higher than that of South Sudan. And so you can see the percentage of deprivation. So the people I looked at were deprived in 67%, they'd be here. But you see in Niger, a lot more people are deprived in 90 to 100% or 80 to 90% than in South Sudan. So you see that the higher intensity is what means that in terms of head count ratios, they swap. South Sudan has a higher head count ratio of poverty, but Niger has a higher poverty. So I will then turn to Adriana. Adriana, I should say, because she won't tell you, she led the MPI team in 2014 and has done amazing work through the years on the MPI. So she's the real expert. If you have questions, ask her.
That's not true. And I didn't leave the 2015, so don't ask me. No, you can always ask me, of course. Okay, so every year, as Sabina was saying, we update as many countries as we can based on availability of new data. And this year, we actually, for the 2015 round, it represented the biggest update so far because 37 countries were updated. This included some new countries that were added into our database, some new countries that didn't have data before, and many countries that were updated in different regions of the world. And this update is representing 2.1 million people in the countries that were updated. What we have, for example, is that, well, like it's mentioned here, for example, that this represented 43% of the population in Africa, 72% of the Arab state, and 82% in East Asia, for example. We are now covering 101 countries, and we have, as Sabina was mentioning, data that covers the period between 2005 and 2014. And this is also covering 5.2 billion people of the world, or 75% of the world's population. This is just to get an idea of what's the representation of each of the, or the distribution of these 5.2 billion people in the different regions of the world. And this is basically our initial findings in terms of the global MPI. The map is showing here the percentage of people that are identified as multidimensionally poor in each of the countries, and it goes from dark green to dark red. So dark green represents countries with very low levels of poverty or very low incidence of multidimensional poverty. Then it goes to lighter shades of green. It starts with lighter shades of red, and then the darker red represents the poorest countries, or the countries with the highest proportion of multidimensionally poor. So we see, for example, that in sub-Saharan Africa, we find the countries with the highest proportion of multidimensionally poor. In particular, we find that 30% of these 5.2 billion people are multidimensionally poor, and that's 1.6 billion people in the 101 countries that we are covering. A lot of people, unfortunately. The poorest countries that we have identified are Niger and South Sudan. Niger has little under 90%, 89.3%, I think, of the population that is multidimensionally poor, and there are 91.1% of the population that are MPI poor in South Sudan. That's one of the new countries that we have updated this year, that we have added this year, South Sudan. And one of the good things, and you're going to learn more about this after lunch, is that the MPI is an index that can be disaggregated to look at not only national aggregates, but also look at regional results. And in this way, we are able to find and to analyze regional differences within countries. So here, for example, we are breaking down the national aggregates for each country to see the regional information. And we still find that in general, the regions in sub-Saharan Africa have very high incidence of poverty, of multidimensional poverty, but there are also some heterogeneities when we compare between countries. And what we find is that actually in the 101 countries that we are covering so far, most of them allow for subnational breakdowns, and we are including 884 subnational regions in these countries, and 53 of them have more than 90% of the population that are multidimensionally poor. So while we only have 2 countries that were around 90%, that had an incidence of around 90%, we actually find that 53 regions in many countries actually have very, very high incidence of multidimensional poverty. And this is also a very descriptive information, because we can see that actually of the MPI poor, that 1.6 billion people that we identify as MPI poor, we find that most of them actually belong or live in countries that are identified as middle-income countries. So even though, based on the World Bank classification of countries, they are middle-income countries, so we wouldn't expect to find very high incidence if we were only looking at income, we see that the MPI is actually complementing this information quite well. So we are actually looking at different things and that really complement each other when we are trying to get a better and more complete picture of what poverty is in the different parts of the world. In this bubble graph, what we are showing in the horizontal axis is the incidence of poverty, or that would be the percentage of people that are identified as MPI poor in each country. So countries that are closest to the left have lower incidence of poverty, but less people that are identified as MPI poor, and to the right we have more people identified as MPI poor. And in the vertical axis we are showing the intensity. That is, how many deprivations do MPI poor people face on average in each country. So basically what we find is that countries that are in this part of the graph have very low incidence and also low intensity of poverty, and then countries that are on the opposite extreme have high incidence and high intensity at the same time. And what the graph allows us to see also is that to see how this information is related or corresponds to different income groups, also based on the World Bank classification. So the different colors of the bubbles represent these 4 different income groups of the World Bank classification, and the size of the bubble is representing the number of absolute people that are identified as MPI poor. So let's go group by group. Here we are showing countries that are classified as high or upper middle income countries. And what we see is that the percentage of people that are multidimensionally poor goes from a very, very low percentage of people, actually 0% in Belarus, it's 10.5% in Peru, and it goes all the way to 42.6% in Namibia. So even though all these countries here in green are considered to be upper middle income countries based on the World Bank classification, we actually see a lot of dispersion in terms of the findings that we have for the global MPI. Now we are adding lower middle income countries, and again we find a lot of dispersity. We find countries that have very low rates, and within these countries we have, for example, we have different countries. So we have, for example, I have the exact number here. I actually wrote it down. We have Armenia with 0.3%. I didn't remember if it was 5% or 3%. So it's very, very low and comparable to upper middle income countries. We have India here with 53.7% of the population identified as multidimensionally poor, and we go all the way to South Sudan, which has 91.1% of the population as MPI poor. Now, actually, 2 weeks after we launched the 2015 upgrade of the MPI, the World Bank reclassified South Sudan as a low-income country, so it's no longer here. But we still wanted to show you this because by the time we launched our figures, that was the current classification. And this is this country is Timor-Leste, which has 67% of the population as MPI poor. So we still, even within the lower middle-income countries, we still find a lot of diversity in terms of what are the results that we are getting for the MPI. Here is just adding the last group, the low-income countries, and again, we have in this corner we have Niger, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and Chad with very high rates of incidence and intensity, but we also find countries that are with much better results for the MPI. For example, Tajikistan is a country that has the lowest percentage of people that are MPI poor, even though it's considered low income by a low-income country by the World Bank, followed by Zimbabwe over here. And you can see that in this graph is placed very close to other countries that are upper middle income countries. So basically what we see with these findings is that they are really complementing each other. They are talking about different phases of poverty and not really being substitutes. This other graph is also showing, is also pointing in the same direction, basically, talking about the complementarity of these two different types of measures of poverty. And here what we are showing is we rank the countries based on the percentage of MPI poor. So here we have the countries, the lighter bar is representing the proportion of MPI poor in each country, and the dots are the proportion of poor based on the $1.25 a day measure of the World Bank. And we're only presenting these dots for countries that have income poverty data that is around 3 years from the year of the survey that we are using from the MPI, so that they are actually comparable. And what we see is that the dots don't actually overlap a lot with our bars. We have some countries that have levels of poverty which are relatively similar using both statistics, but then we have countries in which there are huge disparities between when we are using the monetary poverty measure and when we are using the MPI. Again, there is no substitution here of information. We are actually showing different stories that are both talking about poverty. So, I'm going to talk about that later. That's the proportion of people that's identified as destitute in the country, which is I'm going to talk about this in like 20 minutes. I'm going to come back to the graph. So now I'm giving you with Bouba.
So let's move from the global level to see what we get at the regional level. So we'll have the next 10 minutes to 15 minutes to present what we're obtaining with the global MPI for the two most poorest regions of the world, which is Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Depending on how you define what is the poorest region, or if you think in terms of absolute terms, the number of poor people, South Asia is the poorest region, and if you think in relative terms, in terms of headcount or the rate of poverty, it will be Sub-Saharan Africa. So first, in terms of coverage, in 2015, the global MPI update covered 39 African countries, and out of the 39, we have data which are update data from 2010 to 2014 for 34 countries, and we have disaggregated data at subnational level for 37 countries, so just 2 countries out of the 39 for which we have data this year, which is South Africa and Guinea-Bissau. We don't have subnational. But for the case of South Africa, they have, for example, a national MPI using census data, which is very, very disaggregated, subnational, even at the district level. And so between last year update and this year, also in total, we have 30 out of the 39 countries for Sub-Saharan Africa for which data are just between 2014 and 2015. This is just to say that the data, the 2015 update, most of the update we observed was for Sub-Saharan Africa region. So we got update for Sub-Saharan Africa region in 2015 for 43% of the population. So for 1 year is also too much, and this is also has to do with what Adriana was saying in terms of updates that we have this year. And let's take this side. And so this is what I was saying. So Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest region when you think in relative terms. So 61% of the poor people are in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in South Asia is about 52%. But if you take the total number of MPI poor people, 31% are in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is very far from the 54% that we have in South Asia. And of course, because South Asia is one of the most populated regions of the world. So from the aggregate result, we have the decomposition by region also. On the booklet that you have, you will get some of these results. And when you go on the OFI website, you have more results and all the numbers for your research. But very quickly, what we have here is the sensory heat-con ratio for each of the 10 MPI indicators by region. And the sensory heat-con ratio is actually what is the proportion of people who are multidimensionally poor and deprived in each of the indicators. We will get the chance to get back later to that. So what we observe is that in sub-Saharan Africa, the problem is mostly with the living standard condition. In all of the region, living standard is the one that in which people are more deprived, but in sub-Saharan Africa is a more severe problem. In South Asia, it's more in nutrition, which is a very big problem. So even though the sensory heat-con in South Asia is less than in sub-Saharan Africa in general, but for the nutrition indicators, it's greater than the sub-Saharan Africa. And a region like an Arab state where the problem we have there is more in terms of water. So this is just to give you also like the global MPI, you get something, the global picture, and then you go at the regional level, and then from the region you get to the country level, to the subnational level, and you can focus it on certain indicators and try to see depending on which you want to zoom. So it's kind of illustration and also to see what we have for these two regions. But so if you just, as I was saying, you can do the analysis for the region as a whole, or you can get insight to see how countries are different. And you can see here on this map that the countries are really different. So the very dark red are the poorest region, and the light one are the less poor. And here you find all of the poorest region: Ethiopia, Somalia, and you have here Central African Republic, South Sudan, and so on. I will get back later in terms of numbers. But yeah, you find the poorest countries. I mean, there is no like polarization in terms of south or north, but you have like eastern countries and a bit of Central Africa countries and a bit of North African countries, but you have less poverty in the extreme south, and the north is not defined as. So this was for the MPI itself, and here we have a similar decomposition, but for the two components of MPI, which is the H and the A, the proportion of people who are multidimensionally poor and the intensity of poverty. And here also you can see that countries are very different. So when you take the poorest country here, which are Niger and Ethiopia, you see they are very far from a country here, which is South Africa, where you have almost nothing. And this is the representation of the number of poor people in sub-Saharan Africa. Where do they live in absolute terms? So the poorest country, which is Ethiopia, have, of course, the greatest number of multidimensionally poor, followed by Nigeria, which is one of the most populated country also, and Congo here. And then you find the other side where we have less people living in multidimensional poverty. So this number is again also to convince you the relevance of doing subnational decomposition. So let's take the case of these two countries, which is Nigeria and South Sudan. Nigeria is much more less poorer than South Sudan, because South Sudan is one of, you see the H in South Sudan is 91%, so it's like the level of multidimensional poverty there is really, really high. But when you stop just on this, you cannot get this very interesting story where there are actually three regions of Nigeria which are more poorer than South Sudan. And these three regions, you have them here, Zamfara, Yobe, and Bauchi, which are like, if you just think about how populated is in Nigeria, so even in absolute terms, you have more people living in Nigeria, and even in relative terms, in terms of the level of MPI itself, you have more poverty in Nigeria. So that's really like kind of evidence of the relevance or the necessity even to do this subnational analysis to really know exactly what's going on and how things are going. And this is the census heat count for Nigeria. And again, you have a similar picture that the one I show for Sub-Saharan Africa. So the living standard indicators are the one in which most of the people are deprived, are the one also that contribute more to the multidimensional poverty. And now, so you can do the decomposition by geography, or you can, and also you cross that by indicators, and then you get this kind of pictures where you have the level of poverty at the regional level and the composition of poverty per region. And our aim at the end of next week or by the middle of next week, this is the kind of things that we will produce. It's not to make you like, how you say, not to scare you, but this is the kind of things that we will be doing very shortly. No, the colors are for the indicators. So the green are the living standard, and then you have health, and then you have education.
It's not related to the intensity that you...
No. So, and then you have also another way of doing the subnational analysis or the composition. So we have the case of Cameroon here just to show you also some of the regional disparities that you can have in analyzing poverty. So in Cameroon, the proportion of people living in multidimensional poverty are around 45%. But then when you take the subnational decomposition, you see that it's very diverse. In extreme north, so going in Cameroon, we have something like when you move from the south to the north of the countries, you have more poverty, because all of these regions that you have on the top here are the northern region of Cameroon. You have extreme north, and then you have here East and Adamawa, which are a bit close to the average. So this graph, for example, show that there are very high regional disparity in this country, which is not exactly the case for Ethiopia here, where you have kind of polarization between two sides. You have Addis Ababa here, where you almost have no poverty, and then you have the rest of the countries on the top. And this is in terms of regional disparity and a more ideal situation in the case of Tanzania. So where all the regions have more or less the same level of poverty. So ideally, if we can get just one dot somewhere here for all of the region and countries, that's the ideal situation. Or at least if this is not possible, we get just a dot somewhere here where you have at least a good, less inequality between regions. So I will stop here and leave my colleague present you similar pictures for South Asia and the rest of the presentation.
Thank you. All right, I'm Chris, and I will take you now to South Asia. And as you heard, South Asia was leading in many indicators. It was sadly leading, and we are basically looking now at India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and also Afghanistan. And if we compare the few countries we have to take into account that for India the data is quite old. It's only for 2005, 2006, whereas the other ones are more recent. And as Bouba already mentioned, in South Asia we have 54% of all globally MPI poor people. And what we'd like to know is where those actually live and what are the deprivations they face. And mostly, as he also mentioned, in South Asia, it's basically nutrition, which is the biggest contribution, or which has the biggest censored head count ratio. And we see that it's especially in India. So where do the MPI poor people live in South Asia? And we see that it's mostly in India due to its huge population. So 42% of the globally MPI poor live in India, 5% in Bangladesh, 5% in Pakistan, 1% in Nepal, and smaller amounts in Bhutan, Nepal, Maldives, and 1% in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Why is Sub-Saharan Africa included in here?
So this is showing percentage of global MPI.
Including global. Okay.
Yeah. No problem. And again, if we want to compare the South Asian countries, and we have the headcount ratio on the x-axis and the average intensity on the y-axis, we see that it's quite diverse in South Asia as well. So the Maldives has a very low headcount ratio of poverty of about 5%, and the average intensity is only about 35%. But if you go to Afghanistan, it's almost 70% of the people who are multidimensionally poor, and the average intensity goes up to almost 55%. India, with the huge bubble here that indicates the population, has a slightly lower headcount ratio than Afghanistan, but it has more multidimensionally poor people. Looking closer at India, we see that some of the regions, like this one here, Bihar or Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, have higher headcount ratios than Afghanistan. But some regions like Kerala or Delhi have similar headcount ratios to the Maldives. Not as low, but they are more in that region. What is interesting is that this big bubble, Uttar Pradesh, which is this state here, has a population of about 200 million people. Now 70% of those 200 million people are MPI poor. So 140 million is more than, or it's equivalent to Germany and France. And so just remember always, when you see the percentages, to also look at what you're actually counting. And similarly in Afghanistan, we have quite a divided country between west and east. We see that the south is very poor, and that the center, where Kabul is, or the eastern parts, are less poor. However, if you want to compare it with other South Asian countries, we don't have information on nutrition, so we have to adjust for that, or just take it into account. Similarly, in Bangladesh, we have another case where we have pockets of poverty in the north, in Rangpur or Sylhet or Barisal. And we see those have the highest headcount ratios. However, the biggest number of multidimensionally poor people live in Dhaka, with the biggest bubble here, and that is in the center, even though the headcount ratio is not the highest. In Nepal, we have a nice carpet, but it means that in the northwest we have high poverty, and in the east we have less poverty. And the last case in Pakistan, we have a huge region, Balochistan, which has the highest rate of poverty. And then we have Punjab, which has one of the lowest rates of poverty, but still, due to its population, it has the highest number of MPI poor people. Just to conclude, we can rank our countries in South Asia, from Maldives to Afghanistan, ranked by the headcount ratio. And we see that the headcount ratio ranges from, which are the red buttons, red bars, from 5% to more than 60%, whereas the intensity of poverty only ranges from 35 to about 50%. And all the data, including Bouba's data on Africa and Burkina Faso, is all online, and yeah, it's similar to what you see there, but huge Excel tables and huge do files also, so you can have all of that. And now we're going to China.
A health warning on China. Yesterday I presented the wrong slide. So now you will hear from the expert the right slide on China's income versus poverty cross. But the mistake was mine, not Yangyang.
Thanks, Sabina. Now I will present you a case study of China. And basically, we use the data. It's called CFPS. It's short for China Family Panel Studies. It was collected by Beijing University in China in 2012. And according to our data set, we find China's global MPI is very low. We find only 5.2% of people who are MPI poor, though it still affects more than 75 billion people in China. And among these poor people, we find they are experiencing an average deprivation of 45.2% among all the indicators. Sorry about my cough. And all this leads to China's global MPI of 0.023. Here I present you this graph. It shows actually it's the instance of MPI in 101 countries, and we can see that China's here. So again, it tells us that China's global MPI is not that high. This afternoon, James will talk about the AF methodology, and you will know that this kind of methodology will help us better understand what exactly poverty is like. So in the next few minutes, I will talk about three things. First is who is poor. Second is how are they poor. And the last one is the overlap of the relationship between the income poor and MPI poor. So the next few things are very easy to understand, and I'm sure that in the next few days, you will learn the full skills how to calculate them by yourself. So the first question, who is poor? Basically, if we want to answer this question, we just need to decompose the MPI into different subgroups. And, Okay, so if we consider the subgroups in the national or regional level, we can find that people who are living in China, who are living in the less developed regions are poorer than people living in the other regions. So maybe there's some differences. Okay, so let's see here. So we can see that in China, people who are living in the rural regions or the western regions, where it's full of mountains and the traffic is inconvenient, they are poorer than people who are living in the other regions, and also poorer than people who are living, also poorer than the national level. And if we consider the subgroups on the, let's say, the household level, we can find that households with these characters are more likely to be poor. For example, we find households where the head has no education are more likely to be poor. I mean, they are poorer than the household whose head has higher educations. And also we find that household, the size is more than 5 members are more likely to be poor. Or the household who are receiving the cash transfers are more likely to be poor. Okay, the next question, how are they poor? To answer this question, we can break down the MPI by indicators or dimensions. Here I present you the percentage of people who are poor and deprived. Simply speaking, the higher the column, the higher level of deprivations among poor. And we can see that in China, the MPI poor people are experiencing high level in deprivation on the indicator of nutrition, years of schooling, cooking fuel, and water. So we can see that these 4 indicators contribute most to the MPI poor of China. Okay, the last question was the relationship between income poor and MPI poor. So this slide is the newest update one, so this one is, you can see this. So according to our data set and use China's official poverty line, we find about 12.3% of people who are income poor. And can you still remember what percentage of people who are MPI poor in China? Yeah, someone, yeah, it's correct. It's 5.2%. Thank you. So what's the relationship between these two groups? Sabina has already told you the answer, but let's pretend you don't know the answer. So,
Wrong answer.
so we might imagine that all of these 5.2% people belongs to the side of the income poor. However, you know that it's not the case. When we see the overlap, we find only 1.9% of people who are both income poor and MPI poor. That is quite unexpected. But it also shows that MPI could be a good complement for the income poverty measurement. Okay, that's all my part. So I will leave it again to Adriana.
Okay. So now we're finally getting to the institution and that other darker bar that we have in the graph. I'm going to tell you what that was about. Last year, for the 2014 round of the MPI, we created this new measure, which is also, of course, it's based on the same methodology. You're going to see that there are many similarities with the global MPI, but the difference is that it's a more acute, even more acute, or another way to look at more extreme poverty. So basically, we're using the same data, we're using the same surveys, the same countries that we are using for the global MPI. We are using the same 10 indicators that Sabina presented before. We are using the same weights. So basically, each of the dimensions is weighted 1/3, and then each indicator has same weights within dimensions. And we also are using the same poverty cutoff. That is, that people need to be deprived, or a household needs to be deprived in 1/3 of the weighted indicators to be identified as multidimensionally poor. So all of this has remained exactly the same. What we actually changed are the deprivation cutoffs. That is, for each of the 10 indicators, well, not for each, for 8 of the 10 indicators, we are now using deeper cutoffs. So basically, imagine that this box represents the entire population for a particular country that we are looking at. So we had the original deprivation cutoffs that we were using for each of the indicators, right? For example, having 5 years of schooling, at least one member in the household with 5 years of schooling, or that the household hadn't suffered the death of any child, or that the household had access to electricity. These were our cutoffs that we were using for the original MPI. And those allow us to identify households are deprived or non-deprived in each of the indicators. Based on as mentioned there, the original MPI cutoffs. And then we were combining that, we were basically computing that deprivation score that Sabina was mentioning, which is basically telling us what's the number of weighted deprivations, or what's the proportion of deprivations that a household is facing. And we compare that against this poverty cutoff of 33.3, or 1/3 of the indicators, to identify those who are multidimensionally poor, if they are facing 33% or more, and those who have a lower score, who are identified as non-multidimensionally poor. Even if they are deprived in some things, they are not poor. So this is the group that we were identified initially as MPI poor. That 91.1% in South Sudan, or 89.6% in Niger. Now we are adding something more. We're going to start using, as I was mentioning, deeper cutoffs for 8 of the 10 indicators, and I'm going to go in detail in a second. But we're going to keep this 33% untouched. So we're going to still identify households as deprived or non-deprived in each of the indicators, and we're going to compute their score, their weighted percentage of deprivations that they are facing, and we're going to compare that with the same poverty cutoff of 33.3%. And that subgroup we identify as destitute or deeply poor. So here we have the 10 indicators. So as you see, the list is exactly the same. There are the same 10 indicators. And these are the new cutoffs or the new definitions that we're using. So for example, in the case of schooling, instead of looking or asking a household to have at least one member with 5 years of schooling to be non-deprived, we are now asking for the household to have at least someone with 1 year of schooling. Someone that went at school at all, that completed at least 1 year of formal education. In the case of attendance, we were asking before that no child should be out of school up to grade 8. Now we are asking that at least any child, at least one child, has to be going to school. In the case of nutrition, we were asking before that no child was undernourished, using 2 standard deviations from the reference population. Now we are using 3 standard deviations. And we were using the threshold of 18.5 points of BMI for adults. Now we're using 17.5, indicating an even lower body mass index for adults. In the case of mortality, before a household had suffered the death of at least a child. Now we're asking for the death of 2 or more children for the household to be deprived. And in terms of the housing indicators, living standards, electricity and flooring didn't change, but the other 4 indicators did. So for example, in the case of sanitation, now the household has to have no type of facility at all, basically to be using open defecation. In the case of water, we are using the same classification of the different sources, but instead of using the threshold of 30 minutes for a round trip to fetch the water, we are now using a threshold of 45 minutes. In the case of cooking fuel, coal, lignite, and charcoal are now non-deprived. It's only dung or wood that are considered to be deprived. And in the case of assets, before we were asking the household to have either 2 small assets or a car to be non-deprived. And now we are asking the household to have at least 1 small asset, even if it's a radio or a TV. With just having 1, the household would be non-deprived. So as you can see, basically what we are doing here is to go deeper into poverty. Before we were asking for 5 years of schooling. Now we're asking for just 1. If the household doesn't have anyone who has completed not even 1 year of schooling, it's going to be an even deeper sense of deprivation. And that's the kind of idea, the objective that we had in our mind when we were creating this indicator, to go deeper, to be able to catch, to identify those that are suffering a deeper notion of poverty. Now, as the graph was showing before, this group of deeply poor or destitute are going to be a subgroup of the MPI poor. Because basically, those that don't have 1 year of schooling, that no member has completed 1 year of schooling, of course, they haven't even completed 5 years either. If a household has suffered the death of 2 children, that means that it has suffered the death of 1 or more. So all these new cutoffs that we are using are also including the original MPI, the deprivations cutoff. So basically, we are identifying a subset of the MPI poor who are more deeply poor than the rest. And this is what these darker bars represent. Here, in the lighter shade, we have the proportion of people who are MPI poor. And the darker bars represent the proportion of people that is destitute in each country.
What is that country?
The ones here are South Sudan, Niger, Ethiopia, Chad, Burkina Faso, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Burundi, Mali.
Somalia has those.
No, that's not. Where is? Yeah, Somalia. No, so the ones that are here, Somalia, Madagascar, Yemen, Kenya, they don't have yet information. We haven't computed this destitution yet. So we actually have now, I think it was somewhere. Okay. We actually have now information on destitution for 82 of the 101 countries that we cover in the global MPI. So we don't have information for all of them. In some countries it's not possible because the surveys don't allow to actually change the deprivations cutoff so much. And another is because we are still working on this. This is something that we started computing last year and that we have kept on working on, but we're still missing a few countries that we need to complete, like Somalia, Madagascar, and Yemen. But all the countries that were added in the MPI, that were added or updated in the MPI 2014 update, which were 33, and the 37 that were either added or updated in the 2015 round, they are all here. So actually these ones represent countries that were included in the older versions of the global MPI, and that's why they haven't been updated. Yes?
Practically, how can we interpret the apparent variance in the ordering between the MPI and the destitution measure?
You mean, for example, that here we find that Timor-Leste, for example, it has it has very similar, for example, proportion of MPI poor than Rwanda, yeah. But the proportion of destitute is very different. What we can see is, this is a measure that allows us to see inequality among the poor in a way. And we will go into a precise measure of inequality among the poor next week with Schumann, who's actually going to present that. But this is the first way of looking into inequality among the poor. Basically, what we can see is that in the case of Timor-Leste, that has a much larger bar for destitution, a much larger proportion of the MPI poor are actually deeply deprived. So even though the proportion of people who are MPI poor is similar, we see that the deprivations are much deeper in the case of Timor-Leste. So for example, I don't know the exact numbers for the two countries, right? But to give you an example or to speculate a little bit, we might say that there is a larger proportion of people that have suffered the death of many children in the same household, or that there are more people that have no education at all, or that are or that use open defecation, for example. So there are, even though in both cases those households would be considered to be MPI poor in both countries, then we find deeper deprivations in the case of Timor-Leste, and that's what explains that the destitution bar is much higher in that country. And actually, when we were computing this measure last year, we didn't know exactly what we were going to get, or if the proportion of people. We were using pretty extreme, pretty deep cutoffs, and we weren't expecting to find a very large number. But unfortunately, we find that 736 million people in the world, or in the over 100 countries that we are analyzing, are destitute. So that was, unfortunately, that was shocking to find such a large proportion, and to find that these bars were actually very high for many countries. Yes?
I'm sorry, just coming back to his question. Doesn't the shift in the ranking of the country show that your cutoffs or how you define them is really crucial?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and we're going to talk about this more in other sessions. But all the decisions that are behind the creation of a measure like the MPI are going to impact your results in a way. Here we are not changing the deprivations cutoff slightly. So it's not that we are going to, for 4 years of education or 6 years of education, and change just one indicator at a time. We are changing 8 indicators out of 10, and sharply. The deprivations cutoff really changed. So it's expected that we will find significant changes in the results. That's not surprising. But for example, when we work with countries in creating national measures with them, we do test all that kind of things and making robustness checks by changing cutoffs and changing the K value and changing many of the weights, many of these decisions, to make sure that the final index is not sensitive to these kind of decisions by the analyst. In this case, what we can see is that it's expected to find a like a big change in the numbers, because our decisions, our methodological changes were not small. So it's expected. But yes, in the sense, what you are saying is absolutely right. We see that that decision really makes a big difference in the findings that we're getting. Yes?
Can you differentiate destitute and severe poverty?
Well, yes, because that will depend. For us, the way that we identify people that are in severe poverty is by changing the K value. And that's actually something that we already do. Even though we are now presenting the MPI with a K value of 33%, of 1/3, we actually, in our tables in the website, and that's all available online, we actually present 3 K cutoffs. We present the 33.3%, and those are the people identified as multidimensionally poor, but we also use a K value of 50%. So people need to be deprived in at least 50% of the weighted indicators to be considered severe poor. So when we talk about severe poor poverty, we are talking about changing the K value. So the deprivations cutoff will stay the same. We wouldn't change this.
Okay.
What we change is this. We will still use the same deprivation cutoff there, but change this K. So we will have a subset of people, but a different subset. We will still be using the same deprivations cutoff. They are not deeply poor, but they are deprived in more things at the same time. That's what we mean when we say severity. Deeply, we are maintaining the cutoff of 33.3, but what we are changing is actually the deprivation cutoff for the indicators. That's the difference. I don't know if is that clear enough or not?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. There was another question. Yes.
The concept of intensity of poverty here is the number of dimensions or indicators in which the individual is or household is poor. And yesterday, for example, we talked about intensity in terms of how far away from the cutoff you are.
Yes.
So this is impossible technically, or
No, it's not. Actually, after lunch, James Foster and Sabina will present actually with a lot of detail the Alkire-Foster methodology. And you will see that you can also compute the gap that you have. That's also possible when you want to compute, for example, breadth, or you want to compute severity of poverty. You can do that. Because actually the M0 that we are presenting here as the MPI is just one index of a whole family of indices that you can compute. Now, in order to be able to compute that, you cannot use all sorts of variables. They have to be actually variables that are exactly, so that you can compute those gaps. But we will go into detail, well, not me, but Sabina and James will present that with much more detail right after lunch. In the particular case of the MPI, because of the indicators that we are using and that we have them all in zeros and ones as being deprived or non-deprived, we actually cannot do it. But the methodology allows you to do it, so you could do it with other types of variables. Yeah. Yes. Just one thing. Is it? I'm really over my time, so.
Have you thought about increasing the poverty line rather than decreasing?
Yes, actually, that's another type of experiment that can be done, and it makes sense for a lot of countries. As we see here, this measure of deep poverty is still incredibly relevant for a lot of countries that have very, very high percentages of people that are destitute. But of course, for many countries, the percentage of people that are multidimensionally poor is already super low, and they have 0% destitute. Especially, for example, in the case of Latin America or the Arab states, excluding Yemen and Somalia. So those countries have a particular interest in trying to develop another type of measure, and actually the Arab states are working towards that. CEPAL last year included in the Panorama Social like a type of experiment that they were doing for Latin America, in which they were actually raising the bar. They were raising the deprivations cutoff to have a more middle-income country type of measure. Because again, as Sabina was mentioning, this is a measure that was designed to be internationally comparable across over 100 developing countries, and it's an acute measure of poverty. So, of course, for Latin America, we get rates that are 1, 2, 3% for many countries, very, very low. And we know that that's not representative of the national reality. So that's why the countries are trying to change in their own types of experiments. So yes, it's possible to do it. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go in so that I finish with this. This is just to show you where are the destitute, where do they live. And unsurprisingly, we still find that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia concentrate the vast majority of the destitutes. Again, actually India has 436 million destitutes. So it has over 50% of the destitutes are living in India. But again, as Sabina mentioned before, the data set that we are using is a decade old, and we are really looking forward to the new VHS being completed and released so we can update those numbers. But also, and we also find, which is even more shocking, that we have a very large proportion of destitutes that are living in middle-income countries. So that again talks about inequality within the countries. These are countries with levels of income that are considered middle, like intermediate levels of income, and even so they have a very large proportion of their populations living as destitutes. So it's quite shocking in a bad sense. And this is just to give you an idea of how each of the different indicators that we changed actually, or these four that I'm just presenting here as example, are actually really important. So among the destitute, those those 736 million destitute that we identified in the 82 countries, we find that 40% of them are actually don't have anyone in their homes that have completed not even 1 year of schooling. Over almost 50% are suffering from severe malnutrition. 25% have no assets at all, not even a small radio, nothing at all. And 25% are practicing open defecation. They have no type of facility for sanitation, nothing at all. So as we can see, these are, even if they are very strong types of cutoffs that we are using, very deep types of deprivation cutoff, we're still finding very high proportions, unfortunately. That means that there's a lot of work yet to be done. And just to show you, here we were saying that 34% live in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we actually here have like the distribution among these, of that 34% among the different countries of the area that we're covering in the global MPI, and we see that among Nigeria, Ethiopia, and DR Congo, they concentrate over 50% of the destitutes. And again, here we have some particular numbers for the region, and we see that, for example, in the case of Niger and South Sudan, nearly 70% of their population is destitute. 70% of the population is living in with very deep deprivations. But also in other countries like Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Chad, we also find that over half of their population, more than 50% of the population in these three countries, are also identified as destitutes. Okay, and just this, I think this is my last slide, just to, again, we are always trying to see what's the relationship between our measures and or our multidimensional measures and the more traditional income measures or monetary measures actually that are used to measure poverty, just to see basically how they work together and how much they complement or substitute each other. And what we find once again is that these are complementary measures. Again, in this graph we are showing here the percentage of people that are destitute in the vertical axis, and in the horizontal one the percentage of people that are poor based on $125 a day measure of poverty. And what we see is that, of course, there is some relationship, there is some positive relationship, but we also find, for example, cases in which the proportion of destitute is nearly 30%, but it's only 10% in terms of monetary poverty, and cases where it's even worse. For example, it's nearly 50-60% of the population that is destitute in particular countries, and the rates that we see for monetary poverty are much lower. In the case of Chad, for example, we have 66% of the population identified as destitute, but the $125 a day measure is only 37%. The incidence, when we use that measure, is only 37%. So again, even though there is a relationship, and of course destitution is a way of measuring extreme poverty, if we work in eradicating monetary poverty, that doesn't mean that we are actually eradicating destitution. We actually have a lot of, the overlaps of these two groups is not perfect, and we actually need to work on both of these issues at the same time if we want to have a better result in actually eradicating extreme poverty in all the ways that it's affecting people's lives. So, now it's going to be Christoph. You're having quite a display of all the OFI group today. Everyone's talking.
So I was actually going to talk about two different topics, but we are running a bit late, so I'm skipping the first one, which would be like the relation between the global MPI and other indices. But just to let you know, there's the 8-pager lying over there, and the analysis should be in it. So if you're interested in it, just read it. And so I'm going straight to the changes over time, so the analysis of the development of poverty. So first of all, which countries have we used for the study, or colleagues of mine from OFI did it? Overall, there are 34 countries in this analysis. Some of them are low-income countries, some of them are middle-income countries. The 34 countries are those countries for which there were recent MPI estimates and comparable DHS data for the analysis over time. So 29 of the countries had actually all 10 indicators of the MPI. 4 countries were lacking nutrition. Egypt lacks cooking food. And we cover 338 subnational regions and overall 2.5 billion people, which is around 37% of the world population based on population estimates from 2010. So the global MPI is then estimated using the maximum information available in both data sets. So in countries where the survey design affected the estimation of the MPI, we have made the MPI estimate strictly comparable, which actually means, for example, if in 1 year you're missing the information on nutrition, the information wasn't used in either of the years. So this is to make it strictly comparable across time. For most of our countries, the surveys were a different number of years apart. So for example, in Tanzania, one survey was in 2008, the other one in 2010. And in Gabon, for example, one of the surveys was in 2000 and the other was in 2012. So in order to make comparison across countries, we used annualized changes. The first slide here shows of the results shows the annualized absolute change in MPI poverty across the years. So what you can see is that Nepal, Rwanda, and Ghana had the biggest reduction in multidimensional poverty and annualized absolute changes in poverty. And Armenia, Jordan, and Guyana had the lowest absolute change in MPI poverty. Madagascar even increased poverty. The next slide actually shows the annualized relative changes. So in this case, the starting point is taken into account as well. And when we look at that slide, we see that Armenia is actually leading when it comes to analyze percentage changes in MPI poverty. Other leading countries are the Dominican Republic or Bolivia. And the countries with the lowest reduction are then Senegal, Niger, and Pakistan. So it matters where you start. This slide shows actually the development of poverty for all 34 countries. The size of the bubble is proportional to the number of poor in the first year of the comparison. And the horizontal axis actually has the MPI at the initial year, so in the first year of the comparison. So countries on the right are countries with higher MPI poverty at the initial year, and countries on the left are those countries with lower MPI poverty at the initial year. So on the vertical axis, you have the annual absolute change in MPI poverty. That actually means that if you are at the bottom, you're performing very well. If you are above 0, then you increase poverty. So what does that actually mean? The one where there's cell ref, that's actually Madagascar. So Madagascar has increased poverty, and it did it statistically significant. All other countries reduced poverty, but the countries in red, for those the change was not significant, statistically not significant. The top performing countries are those at the bottom. This means it's Ghana, Nepal, Rwanda, Bolivia, Cambodia. These are the countries who did actually perform quite well.
What's the biggest bubble?
That's India. It's normally always India, the biggest bubble. Because it's the size, also it's proportional to the number of poor people. This slide actually shows how poverty has changed in terms of indicators. 10 countries reduced all MPI indicators that were Bolivia, Cambodia, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Gabon, India, Indonesia, Mozambique, Nepal, and Rwanda. However, we can also see that the profiles vary in how the countries reduced poverty. For example, Rwanda had the biggest reduction in electricity and sanitation. Then we see here, for example, that the school attendance rate was mostly increased in Ghana. In Tanzania, we see that child mortality has improved, or again, electricity. And so the profiles vary between countries, and you can decompose by indicators to see these changes over time. So when we disaggregate by subnational regions, we find that poverty significantly decreased in 208 out of the 338 subnational regions, which house 78% of the poor. In 8 countries, 8 countries have reduced poverty in all subnational regions, that were Bangladesh, Bolivia, Gabon, Ghana, Malawi, Mozambique, Niger, and Rwanda. And in 9 countries, the poorest region reduced poverty the most. And that happened in Bangladesh, Bolivia, Colombia, Egypt, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, and Niger. We've actually talked about the possibility to decompose by groups already, and that's an important property of the MPI. And we can also do this by ethnic groups over years. So what this slide actually shows is, again, the MPI poverty at the initial year, and the absolute annual changes in MPI poverty at the vertical axis. So what we can see now is that the ethnic group of the poor had the highest initial poverty, but also no reduction in poverty. So this group is actually left behind. And when we go to Kenya, we see actually the opposite. So the group of the Somali, which is the highest initial poverty, actually improved the most. So in Kenya, the poor are actually catching up. Lastly, we have a slide on the MPI incidence and the changes of MPI incidence and the income poverty incidence. And when we take a look at how the countries performed, we see, for example, that Rwanda, Ghana, and Bolivia reduced MPI poverty 2 to 3 times faster than income poverty. When we look at Nepal, we see that Nepal reduced both income poverty and MPI poverty. When we look, for example, at Cambodia, Uganda, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Niger, we see that they did actually quite good in income poverty, in reducing income poverty, but not at the same level in multidimensional poverty.
You're comparing the headcounts, right?
Yeah, that's the headcounts now. And however, when we only look at the reduction in income poverty, we wouldn't see that Rwanda, Ghana, and Bolivia did actually quite well in reducing MPI poverty. So again, we find differences in what MPI and the income poverty measure. That's actually it. And I guess now Schumann is going to talk about, it skipped. So Sabina is going to do the rest.
Schumann, were you Schumann?
No, he's not here.
Okay. We cut inequality, and Schumann's going to present it when he presents inequality next week. So I just want to close by, you've heard a lot of things, so before we have a little bit of time for interaction with any of us, just want to point out that a lot of this is on the website. Some of it is actually trying to be a bit more accessible so infographics, which are supposed to be trying to explain this stuff to teenagers, to grandmothers, to people who might not really open up the kinds of reports, even policy briefings that you're looking at. But we try to explain the MPI intuitively to people who are not going to understand additive subgroup decomposability or dimensional breakdown properties. And just the metaphor that one of our communications officers came up with early on was a high-resolution camera lens, which Zach could tell you all about. But basically it means that when you zoom in, whether it's, as Bouba said, from the world to major geographic regions to countries to subnational regions, or for any of them from your MPI to H&A, or from MPI to each of the indicators, you're able to see different aspects of poverty. And so, although there is one number, which is MPI, which is a headline figure, what makes the MPI multidimensional is not only that it's made up of many numbers, but that also you can pull it apart or fold it and unfold it, as Gaston would say, in different ways to understand poverty. And so I think that's why it's sort of a system of numbers rather than a single number. And we'll go into a little bit of how some of those numbers are computed this afternoon. for those of you who haven't had a look at the website, just so that you know, we mentioned Natalie, but there are some case studies, ground reality checks from different countries up on our website where we have tried or our friends have tried. Zach did one, Bouba did one, a friend of Christian's did one. So there are different people who have gone to really try to understand a little bit more about the lived stories of people who are MPI poor, and it helps us to see the oversights as well as the insights of this measure. Who's here? Puba from Bhutan was very happy. Manuel and Lola had a great relationship. It doesn't really cover relationships. Enda actually had a bit of a family tragedy, so she had some grief as well. Agata was in Madagascar, also had somebody in prison in her family, and Rabia is one of the different Indian case studies. And again, other things come up both to enrich life as well as to things like disability or loneliness, which are not covered. Then there are policy briefings, which is what you have. So you have an 8-page policy briefing. That's too long for very, very fast and important people, so they need 2 pages or 1 paragraph. Go figure. Then we have longer briefings, for example, on China or destitution or others that you can look at. For each country, we simply put together the material in a graphical form for those countries, and you may have looked at it on the website, but these are updated each year. And then there's an interactive data bank. So all of the slides that Bouba and Christian showed about the regions were simply screenshots of that country from the data bank. So you can make those screenshots if you're doing your own presentations. And there are additional things we didn't show that are possible. And then at the moment we have the estimations available online as Excel files. And so the first 2 tables give the overall national results together with the related sub-indices, the consistent and partial indices. Then we look at rural and urban, and then subnational regions, then changes over time, and then table 7 has basic statistics for every MPI we've ever released. So you can have a look at that. Don't use that to compare over time. Use the harmonized ones, table 6, if you're comparing over time. So those are in a sense, for you to download, but also so that you know and can share it with other colleagues who might be of interest. And then just to tell you a little bit about the back end of this work, there are a lot of different people involved. The youngest when we did it in 2010 was a man of 21 who was an undergraduate. And I don't know how old the oldest is, it's probably me. But it's basically a team effort, and so a lot of people in different places have helped to compute, have helped to translate, and to understand the MPI. So it's very much a team effort, as most of the things we do are, and we're grateful to everyone.